rolls her over the heap to double its size; but she soon grows restless, and can only be pacified with the blood of fresh human victims. But the best known case of human sacrifices systematically offered to ensure good crops is supplied by the Kondhs or Kandhs, another Dravidian race, in Bengal. Our knowledge of them is derived from the accounts written by British officers who, about the middle of the 19th century, were engaged in putting them down. The sacrifices were offered to the earth goddess Tari Pennu or Bera Pennu, and were believed to ensure good crops and immunity from all disease and accidents. In particular, they were considered necessary in the cultivation of turmeric, the Kondhs arguing that the turmeric could not have a deep red colour without the shedding of blood. The victim, or Meriah, as he was called, was acceptable to the goddess only if he had been purchased, or had been born of a victim, that is, the son of a victim father, or had been devoted as a child by his father or guardian. Kondhs in distress often sold their children for victims, considering the beatification of their souls certain, and their death, for the benefit of mankind, the most honourable possible. A man of the Panua tribe was once seen to load a Kondh with curses, and finally to spit in his face, because the Kondh had sold for a victim his own child, whom the Panua had wished to marry. A party of Kondhs, who saw this, immediately pressed forward to comfort the seller of his child, saying, "Your child has died that all the world may live, and the earth goddess herself will wipe that spittle from your face." The victims were often kept for years before they were sacrificed. Being regarded as consecrated beings, they were treated with extreme affection, mingled with deference, and were welcomed wherever they went. A Meriah youth, on attaining maturity, was generally given a wife, who was herself usually a Meriah or victim, and with her he received a portion of land and farm stock. Their offspring were also victims. Human sacrifices were offered to the earth goddess by tribes, branches of tribes, or villages, both at periodical festivals and on extraordinary occasions. The periodical sacrifices were generally so arranged by tribes and divisions of tribes that each head of a family was enabled, at least once a year, to procure a shred of flesh for his fields, generally about the time when his chief crop was laid down. The mode of performing these tribal sacrifices was as follows. 10 or 12 days before the sacrifice the victim was devoted by cutting off his hair, which until then had been kept unshorn. Crowds of men and women assembled to witness the sacrifice. None might be excluded, since the sacrifice was declared to be for all mankind. It was preceded by several days of wild revelry and gross debauchery. On the day before the sacrifice, the victim, dressed in a new garment, was led forth from the village in solemn procession, with music and dancing, to the Meriah grove, a clump of high forest trees standing a little way from the village, and untouched by the axe. There they tied him to a post, which was sometimes placed between two plants of the Sankissar shrub. He was then anointed with oil, ghee, and turmeric, and adorned with flowers, and a species of reverence which it is not easy to distinguish from adoration was paid to him throughout the day. A great struggle now arose to obtain the smallest relic from his person. A particle of the turmeric paste with which he was smeared, or a drop of his spittle, was esteemed of sovereign virtue, especially by the women. The crowd danced round the post to music, and addressing the earth, said, "O God, we offer this sacrifice to you. Give us good crops, seasons, and health." Then, speaking to the victim, they said, "We bought you with a price, and did not seize you. Now we sacrifice you according to custom, and no sin rests with us." On the last morning the orgies, which had been scarcely interrupted during the night, were resumed, and continued till noon, when they ceased, and the assembly proceeded to consummate the sacrifice. The victim was again anointed with oil, and each person touched the anointed part, and wiped the oil on his own head. In some places they took the victim in procession round the village, from door to door, where some plucked hair from his head, and others begged for a drop of his spittle, with which they anointed their heads. As the victim might not be bound nor make any show of resistance, the bones of his arms, and if necessary his legs, were broken; but often this precaution was rendered unnecessary by stupefying him with opium. The mode of putting him to death varied in different places. One of the commonest modes seems to have been strangulation, or squeezing to death. The branch of a green tree was cleft several feet down the middle; the victim's neck, in other places his chest, was inserted in the cleft, which the priest, aided by his assistants, strove with all his force to close. Then he wounded the victim slightly with his axe, whereupon the crowd rushed at the wretch and hewed the flesh from the bones, leaving the head and bowels untouched. Sometimes he was cut up alive. In Chinna Kimedy he was dragged along the fields, surrounded by the crowd, who, avoiding his head and intestines, hacked the flesh from his body with their knives till he died. Another very common mode of sacrifice in the same district was to fasten the victim to the proboscis of a wooden elephant, which revolved on a stout post, and, as it whirled round, the crowd cut the flesh from the victim while life remained. In some villages Major Campbell found as many as 14 of these wooden elephants, which had been used at sacrifices. In one district the victim was put to death slowly by fire. A low stage was formed, sloping on either side like a roof; upon it they laid the victim, his limbs wound round with cords to confine his struggles. Fires were then lighted, and hot brands applied, to make him roll up and down the slopes of the stage as long as possible, for the more tears he shed the more abundant would be the supply of rain. Next day the body was cut to pieces. The flesh cut from the victim was instantly taken home by the persons who had been deputed by each village to bring it. To secure its rapid arrival, it was sometimes forwarded by relays of men, and conveyed with postal fleetness 50 or 60 miles. In each village all who stayed at home fasted rigidly until the flesh arrived. The bearer deposited it in the place of public assembly, where it was received by the priest and the heads of families. The priest divided it into two portions, one of which he offered to the earth goddess by burying it in a hole in the ground, with his back turned and without looking. Then each man added a little earth to bury it, and the priest poured water on the spot from a hill gourd. The other portion of flesh he divided into as many shares as there were heads of houses present. Each head of a house rolled his shred of flesh in leaves, and buried it in his favourite field, placing it in the earth behind his back without looking. In some places each man carried his portion of flesh to the stream which watered his fields, and there hung it on a pole. For 3 days thereafter no house was swept, and in one district strict silence was observed; no fire might be given out, no wood cut, and no strangers received. The remains of the human victim, namely the head, bowels, and bones, were watched by strong parties the night after the sacrifice, and next morning they were burnt, along with a whole sheep, on a funeral pile. The ashes were scattered over the fields, laid as paste over the houses and granaries, or mixed with the new corn to preserve it from insects. Sometimes, however, the head and bones were buried, not burnt. After the suppression of the human sacrifices, inferior victims were substituted in some places; for instance, in the capital of Chinna Kimedy a goat took the place of a human victim. Others sacrifice a buffalo. They tie it to a wooden post in a sacred grove, dance wildly round it with brandished knives, then, falling on the live animal, hack it to shreds and tatters in a few minutes, fighting and struggling with each other for every particle of flesh. As soon as a man has secured a piece, he makes off with it at full speed to bury it in his fields, according to ancient custom, before the sun has set; and as some of them have far to go, they must run very fast. All the women throw clods of earth at the